So in 1707, John Mill published an edition of the Greek New Testament, where he had studied about 100 manuscripts of the New Testament, and he realized that this verse is worded differently in this manuscript or this manuscript. And so what he did is he print a few lines of the text, and at the bottom of the page he would print where manuscripts of different readings. But he, in the entire edition of the New Testament, he found 30,000 places where the manuscripts differed, and people went ballistic because they saw this and they thought he's attacking the Bible. You can't do that. And so his defenders said, look, he's not attacking the Bible. He didn't invent these places. He's just telling you they exist. They exist whether he said it or not. And, you can either ignore it or you can deal with it. And so it led to a huge furor. And it's in some ways what started the entire discipline.
It's God. It's God. It's God. It's God.
When I was in high school, I had a born-again experience, and I became a conservative, evangelical Christian. And I believed that the Bible was the inerrant Word of God. That's what I had been taught. And I went off to a fundamentalist Bible college, went to Moody Bible Institute, and I started studying the Bible. But one of the things I learned early on was that we don't have the original manuscripts. So when Mark wrote a gospel, he wrote something, and we don't have that thing he wrote. We have copies of it and we actually don't have copies. We've got copies of copies of copies that are many centuries later. I realized that as an evangelical, but the more I studied it, these manuscripts started bothering me a little bit, because I had believed that the Bible was God's words. It's not just that it was like his communication broadly, it was his very words. But then as more I thought about it, I realized, there are places where we don't know what the words are. There are entire passages in the Bible that I was familiar with that probably weren't originally there. They're in some manuscripts, but not in other manuscripts. And so somebody's either added them or somebody's taken them away. And if God gave us his words, why don't we have them? And so studying Greek made me start digging deeper and deeper into the text. And you start realizing that you see things that you can't see in English. And some of the things I started seeing started bothering me because I started realizing, that doesn't say what I thought it said. And in fact, what Mark says here in this verse in Greek doesn't line up very well with what Matthew says about the same thing. I said, oh boy, here we go.
I think one of the things that possibly might surprise people who are maybe Christians, maybe very familiar with the Bible, is that these variants, these changes haven't all been like magically resolved in the English translations that we read today, right? We still have these problems in the Bible that is used in churches.
Well, that's right. And in reality, some of the favorite passages that we know in the Bible that are among my favorite passages are almost certainly not originally there. This isn't just kind of the crazy idea of a liberal New Testament scholar teaches at Chapel Hill. This is, I knew this when I was at Moody Bible Institute. It just didn't bother me very much. But the famous story of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery, I think it's got to be the most famous story in the Gospels, because it's in every Jesus movie ever made. So it's like this woman's been caught in adultery, and they drag her in front of Jesus. And they say she's been caught in the act of adultery. The Jewish leaders say she's been caught in the act of adultery. And according to the law of Moses, we're supposed to stone her to death. What do you say? And so this is setting up a trap, because if he says, well, yeah, stone her to death, then he's violating his own teachings of love and forgiveness and mercy. But if he says, no, let her go, then he's breaking the law of Moses. And so what's he supposed to do? Well, he stoops down, and he starts writing on the ground, and he looks up and he says, let the one without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her. He stoops back down, starts writing on the ground again. They all start realizing they're sinful, and they walk away one by one until he's left alone with the woman. He stands up and he says, is there no one here left to condemn you? And she says, no, Lord, no one. He says, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. This is a fantastic story. This is
a wonderful story.
It's a great story, but it's not in any of the old manuscripts of the Gospel of John. Church fathers who wrote commentaries on John don't know about it until the 12th century in Greek. And so this is not a debated thing among scholars that this passage doesn't belong in the Gospel of John, or it's nowhere else in the New Testament. So there are other passages that are not as well known where a similar thing happens, or where scholars just can't agree among them, like hundreds of places where scholars just can't agree. What was the original wording here? Scholars who are, committed evangelicals, to scholars who are atheists, to everything in between, just study these things with the same tools, and the evidence isn't clear. Was the passage worded this way, or was it worded that way? And most of the time, look, I need to be emphatic on this point. Most of the time, these differences don't matter for anything, but some of them really matter, and they affect what a passage means, or even the theology of an entire book, depend on which passage, and scholars can't agree which one it is, this or that.
How does that kind of realization affect you or anyone viewing the Bible as inerrantly inspired?
Well, this was what got me starting to wonder whether my views about the Bible were correct, because I believed that God had given us the words. I wasn't quite sure how it happened. I wasn't sure, did he dictate the words to the authors, or did he just make sure they didn't write the wrong words, or, what did God do to do it? But he did it, and the words, there were no mistakes in the words. And so that was my belief. But the more I thought about this problem that we have these changes in all these manuscripts, it made me wonder, well, if God wanted us to have his words, that's why he would have inspired them in the first place. So God wanted us to have his words. If he wanted us to have his words and he inspired the words, why didn't he make sure that we still have his words? It wouldn't be any more difficult. It wouldn't be more of a miracle to make sure the scribes didn't change anything significant. But he obviously didn't do that, because we know he didn't do that, because we can't decide what the words are sometimes. So I started thinking, if I don't think God preserved the words, then I don't probably have no reason to think he actually inspired the words. And if that's the case, I started realizing the Bible is a very human book. This book was handed on by scribes who changed things. And if the scribes could change things, why couldn't the authors change things? God didn't stop the scribes. Why would he? What makes me think he stopped the authors?
And that's kind of related to an anecdote you tell in Misquoting Jesus, where you're a graduate student at Princeton, you're writing a paper for Cullen's story on a passage in Mark that contains a slight contradiction, and you describe how you wrote a really long and complex argument explaining it away, and you're convinced that your professor is going to be very impressed and absolutely understand where you're coming from, because he himself is also a Christian. But the only comment you received was, maybe Mark just made a mistake. This was, from how you write about it, it was clearly a pivotal moment for you, but why was it so profound?
Well, it was because, I'd started wondering, if maybe God didn't give us the words. And as an evangelical, I was convinced there could not be any contradictions in the Bible. I'm not talking about a difference, like John says one thing about Jesus, Matthew says a different thing. Well, they both might be just like one saying part of it and the other saying the other part. It doesn't necessarily, but if there's a contradiction, where actually they both can't be right, then, well, that's, one of them's wrong. Yeah. And so that was my view. And I started wondering about that because of these manuscripts. And so that's right. So I took this class, and it was early in my master's degree. It has to do with the passage in Mark chapter 2. And in this case, it wasn't a problem about a scribe changing the text. It's what apparently was the original text. In Mark chapter 2, Jesus' disciples are going through the grain fields, and they're plucking. It's a Sabbath, and they're hungry, so they're eating some grain off of the stalks. And Pharisees are standing around, and they see what they're doing. They get all upset, and they tell Jesus to tell disciples stop that. They're not
control your people.
Get them under control here. They're your followers. And Jesus says, "Come on, don't you remember what King David did when Abiathar was the high priest? How he and his people were hungry, and they went into the temple and they ate the showbread that only the priests are supposed to eat. Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath." And so in other words, it's okay to eat if you're hungry on the Sabbath, even if it means plucking some grain. My term paper was trying to explain this one little detail in this passage. It's when Jesus says that Abiathar was the high priest. All of our manuscripts have that Abiathar. So it's something that really was in the Gospel of Mark. But the thing is, when you read the passage in 1 Samuel, Abiathar was not the high priest. His father Ahimelech was the high priest at the time. And so this is one of these things, these little picayune little contradictions. And I wrote this big, I don't know, it was 30 pages or something, arguing that on the basis of this detailed explanation of the grammar, that in fact, it's not a contradiction. That when Mark says Abiathar was the high priest, he doesn't mean Abiathar was the high priest. He just kind of means, I came up with some explanation for it's not a contradiction. And yeah, my professor, Colin Story, he was a very, very committed Christian and pretty conservative theologically, but he just, what if Mark just made a mistake? I'm like, maybe Mark, that's an easier solution. And once I realized that, that started opening the floodgates for me. If you could have one little contradiction, then you need to see if there are other little contradictions. And if you got other little, maybe a big contradictions, and it started changing my view of Scripture.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I see quite a lot online with online apologetics is a lot of people doing what you did in that paper and coming up with complex arguments to say, isn't it possible that X, that it's not a contradiction, that this isn't incorrect somehow?
Well, that's right. I mean, all of history is a matter of establishing what's most probable. You're never going to definitively prove history because, it's not like a chemistry experiment where you can do it 1,000 times and come up with the same results. If you don't change the variables, history can't be repeated. And so all we do with history of every kind is just trying to establish what probably happened. And so with the Bible, I had been firmly convinced there were no errors. And so I was one of these guys who would, like these apologists, who would just, reconcile everything. Well, it could be this, it could be that. And after a while, you start looking at it and say, is that really likely? And the thing is, if you start getting if you just have one or two of these problems in the Bible, you could probably do that. But when you've got dozens and hundreds of them just in the New Testament, you get to a point you're saying, every one of these, I've got to say the unlikely thing is the right one, every time. Yeah. So at a point, I got to a point where I just said, look, it is humanly possible to write an inerrant book. I mean, I can write an email that lists all the addresses of everybody in my neighborhood and not make a single mistake. It could be inerrant. But how do we decide if something is inerrant? Well, one way is to go in ahead of time and say, look, whatever else somebody tells me, I know this is inerrant. And so if you see something that looks like an error, well, it can't be an error because it's inerrant. And so you reconcile. The other way to do it is just to look at it and see, is it inerrant? And then decide. And so if you're doing this list of addresses, just look, do they have the wrong address there? And if you find errors, so it's a different way of doing it. And it's a different way of doing it theologically. So instead of starting out by saying the Bible has to be inerrant because God says it's inerrant and I believe, and so therefore it is inerrant. Instead of that, why don't you just look to see if it's inerrant? Because if it's not, then the truth is that it's not. That's the truth. And the truth should matter to Christians.
It should. And people often say it does, but I suspect, as you well know, when the truth means a drastic shift in your own personal faith, that is a little more challenging.
Well, and the thing is, it's not like correcting a mathematical problem. It's like you something wrong on your math test and you realize, oh yeah, I messed that one up. I divided by 0. You can't do that. It's not like that kind of thing. It's more like something that's the very core of your existence. Your faith. I mean, it's what you believe reality to be about, and truth and meaning and the world and your human. And so these kinds of faith issues end up being far more deeply disturbing than just matters of, regular matters of fact.
No, I would definitely agree with you. One of the things that struck me personally when I started learning ancient languages and doing my own translation work is exactly how nuanced a job it is. Did you have any similar translation difficulties that you found troubling when you were looking at?
Well, I certainly realized that just changing a single letter sometimes can change what an entire passage means. And sometimes they're pretty big things. I'll give you one example. There's this passage in 1 Timothy 3:16, which is sometimes used to argue that Jesus is called God. Because it says, if you look at verse Timothy 3:16, it says Jesus Christ, who, and it goes on to say so and so, goes on to say such and such. Jesus Christ, who, or in some manuscripts, instead of saying Jesus Christ, who, it says Jesus Christ, God, who. Okay, and so in that case, it's calling Jesus Christ God. And the thing is, this is one of those things you just wouldn't know. You look at this translation and you think, well, this translation says Jesus, it's called Jesus God. This one just says who. It's a relative pronoun. And so what's that all about? Well, I'll tell you what it's about. There are two letters in Greek. There's a theta, which looks like a 0 with a line through it, and there's an omicron, which is an O. So you got an O, or you have an O going with a line through the middle. Okay, if the original text had the theta, the O with a line through it, it calls Jesus God. If it's just the O without the line through it, it's who.
Yeah.
And so, which is it? It's just what, it's not even just, I mean, yeah, it's one letter. It's also like, it's just a line. And that affects whether the New Testament ever directly calls Jesus, whether the Apostle Paul ever calls Jesus directly God or not. So yeah, it's,
wow.
important.
That is a huge theological thing.
Big, based on like a line going through a letter.
Wow. So how do you try and work out which is the original then?
Well, the funny thing is there's actually a long discussion about this among scholarship. There was this 17th century scholar named Wettstein, 18th century scholar named Wettstein, who was looking at the oldest manuscript available for First Timothy that others had looked at and had said that it had the theta, that it said God. And so he was examining this manuscript and he's looking at it very closely, and he realizes that on the page where it looks like you've got that 0 with the line through the theta, that the line that's going through that 0 actually isn't on that side of the page. On the other side of the page, there's writing on the other side, and there's a line on the other side exactly across from the omicron, from the O, and that line is bled through the page. The ink is bled through the page to make it look like that omicron is a theta.
Wow.
And he sees this and says, oh my God, that's an omicron. That is not a theta. And this is our oldest manuscript. And in his case, in Wettstein's case, it started making him think that Jesus really wasn't God. It was like a big turn in his life. And, oh my God. So yeah. So sometimes, the smallest little details can make a big difference. And, and most Bible readers, of course, aren't, they don't go into the details, but the details end up mattering sometimes.
Significantly so. Wow. That's a lot. That changes like the entire theology behind Christianity as a modern religion.
My evangelical opponents, who are almost always friends of mine, a lot of them have pointed out, yeah, look, these are picky and little things. They don't really matter for very much. And they have that kind of view. And they say things like, none of these changes affects any of the major doctrines of Christianity. And so they're not that important. And the thing is, I agree with them that none of these single changes, this change in 1 Timothy 3:16 is not going to change the Nicene Creed. It's not going to change everything because it's not that kind of thing. I mean, you'd have to change everything. So that doesn't mean it's not important. It's important whether the Apostle Paul thought Jesus was God or not. And if it's not in that passage, which passage is it? And you have to look at all of them. But the way I explain it to people is that these textual changes among the manuscripts, maybe they won't affect your doctrine of the Trinity, or maybe they won't affect your view about the Holy Spirit, or maybe they won't affect some major doctrine you've got. I said, but if tomorrow morning we all woke up and it turned out that the New Testaments around the world suddenly, for some inexplicable reason, we no longer had the Gospel of Mark, the book of Hebrews, or the book of James. Those 3 books just disappeared. Would that matter?
Yeah.
Yes, that would matter. Would it change any essential doctrine of Christianity? No. So the essential doctrines of Christianity are not the only things that matter.
Thank you. Do you have any thoughts on why some people retain their faith through this process and some people don't?
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot, obviously, because I myself have left that camp, and I know others also who have left the camp. What ends up happening is people start studying and they realize something like this thing about the scribes changing the text, and they realize, well, it's a very human process copying books, and that's when they start seeing things like contradictions. And for me, it was the contradictions that led me away from being an evangelical.
Mm-hmm.
And so evangelicals have no trouble recognizing there are manuscripts, there are differences in the manuscripts. You need to figure out the original text. Most evangelicals, that's not very problematic, but it's the contradictions and the mistakes in the Bible, the errors, just flat out errors, geographical errors, historical errors, scientific errors. That tends to lead people away from an evangelical point of view once they realize these really are errors.
But can you maybe just take a couple of minutes and explain to us why this is an important topic?
Yeah, well, it's important for a couple of reasons. For people of faith, it's obviously important to know what the Bible says. And this entire study of that scholars call textual criticism, which is trying to reconstruct what the original texts said. Textual criticism is not about interpretation or about understanding a text. It's not about criticizing a text. It's not about trying to figure out what historically happened behind the text. It's none of those things. It's a technical term referring to trying to establish what the text originally said and how it got changed. And so with the New Testament, it's trying to figure out, when you're studying the Gospel of Luke, it's not trying to understand what it means. It's trying to figure out what the oldest form of the words are, hopefully the words that the author wrote.
Thank you. So one of the byproducts of having so many copies of these manuscripts is that each time a manuscript is copied, there is an opportunity for additions to be made or mistakes to be made. What kinds of changes do we most commonly see in the New Testament manuscripts?
Yeah, it's actually a fairly easy question to answer because, there's kind of a limited number of things you could look for. And scholars typically, in a very broad sense, differentiate between what are almost certainly just accidental slips of the pen, accidental mistakes, and what look like they're probably made intentionally. Like if you have an entire story that is added in some manuscripts and missing from other manuscripts, somebody's either taking it in or taking it out or putting it in. And so and there are some changes that they certainly look like they're intentional. So these accidental changes are the ones that are usually the easiest to find, and they're by far the most numerous.
Do the professional scribes make different kinds of errors or changes to the manuscripts?
They tend to make fewer accidental mistakes, although not always. On the other hand, since a lot of these later copyists, for example, were monks, intelligent and probably theologically educated, they tended to make changes that would be more theologically important. In other words, if the text is saying something that they think that could be really misread, or somebody might misunderstand that if they don't, they'll clarify it by rewording it, or sometimes they'll say, this looks like, boy, a heretic could use this one. And they'll change it in order to make it clear, actually, it's not saying what this heretic might want it to say. And so they put it in other words. Mm-hmm. And so that tends to happen when you've got more educated, highly theologically trained scribes.
Does that then mean that we have different manuscripts maybe espousing different theologies based on who has been copying them?
I looked for manuscripts that had one leaning or another. Like, is this manuscript done by somebody who believes that Jesus is so much God that he's not really human, and so they've changed it? Or is this manuscript done by a scribe who thinks Jesus is fully human and he wasn't really God in the sense that he's always God? And so they have these different views, but we don't have manuscripts that line up that way. Mm-hmm. What we have are textual changes that are made at various times in various places by various scribes that happen to be surviving in our surviving manuscripts. So there may have been at one time, and the early church fathers say that there were at one time. None of those manuscripts survived, probably because later Christians didn't want to copy heretical manuscripts.
Do those changes then make it into the New Testament as we have it, as is currently read in churches?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, lots of these changes do. And there are some of these changes that it's clear somebody's changed the text, and it's not clear which way the change went.
Oh, interesting.
You have two forms of the text, right? You have a verses saying one thing or verses saying a different thing. So somebody's changed it, and they could be mean radically different things. And the Bibles will print one of those. Obviously, they don't print both of them. And so I'll give you one example. Can I give you an example?
Please.
This is one of my favorite examples. It was the subject of one of the first articles I ever wrote. People are used to this phrase, sweating blood. Oh boy, he's sweating blood. Where does that come from? It comes from Luke chapter 22, as it turns out. In Luke chapter 22, you have the account of Jesus going to the garden to pray right after the Last Supper and before he's arrested, where he goes and asks God to remove this cup from him because he doesn't want to go through with it if he doesn't have to. In some manuscripts, what it says is that Jesus went into deep agony, and he starts sweating, and his sweat was like great drops of blood falling to the ground, and an angel came and comforted him. So that's Luke chapter 22, verses 43 and 44. You'll find it in most Bibles. There are a number of manuscripts, including our oldest and best manuscripts, that don't have those verses. I argue what happened is that the oldest and best manuscripts don't have these verses. They're at odds with other parts of the Gospel of Luke. They don't fit in the context very well. I argue for a lot of reasons that the verses were not original, and that the person who added them wanted to add them in order to show that Jesus was fully human. He's sweating blood. He's really upset. And so it's trying to promote the humanity of Jesus against people who are saying that he was so divine, he didn't really suffer much.
When you have this kind of debate, how do you go about trying to determine the original meaning? Do you just go with the oldest manuscript? Do you go with the majority view? What kinds of things play into that argument?
Yeah, so, you're trying to decide were these verses in there or not. And there's no question that somebody changed the manuscript. So people say, well, how do you know people changed the manuscript? You're just saying they're changing manuscripts. So you're just making that up. Not making it up. You got two manuscripts. Some have it, some don't. So you got to explain it. Something's happened here. And so I'm going to take a minute to explain this because it's a little bit, it's kind of a lengthy thing. So what scholars do is they people who are experts in this field divide the kinds of evidence that they look at into what they call external evidence and internal evidence. So the external evidence is what kinds of manuscripts support having the verses and which ones support not having the verses. And when you're looking at what kinds of manuscripts, you've got all sorts of questions in mind. For example, you might want to know how many manuscripts have one reading, but not another reading. And so, for example, you might think off the top of your head, yeah, well, majority rules, right? I mean, suppose you've got 600 manuscripts that have the verses and 5 manuscripts that don't have the verses. Well, you think 600 to 5, that's a no-brainer,
Easy.
Right? Except it's not. And the reason it's not is this. They look at other things. They look, how old are the manuscripts? If these 5 manuscripts that have it are from the 3rd and 4th centuries, and the however many I said, 600, I forget what I said, however many do have it, are 600 have it, but they're like from the 13th and 14th centuries, like they're 1,000 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that does matter. And so you look at you might want to look a little bit at the number, but you have to think about the number. But you look at the age of the manuscript, you look about whether one reading is found in only one locality. Oh, this is found only in manuscripts copied in Italy, whereas this other one's found everywhere in the Christian world. And you look at some manuscripts are better than others. I mean, there are places where it's obvious this manuscript's made a lot of mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you get a reading that's found in manuscripts that make a lot of mistakes generally, and you've got another reading that's found in manuscripts generally don't make many, well, that tips the balance. That's just the external evidence. Now, would you like me to talk about the internal?
I would.
Because this is where it actually gets a little more interesting for me and for a lot of people, is you not only look to see which manuscripts have these things, you also look to see which reading makes the best sense on internal grounds. So external evidence is what witnesses, what manuscripts have. Internal grounds is what makes better sense of which reading. So you've got two manuscripts, two different readings, say, and you ask a number of questions. One question is, if you've got a reading that is seems to be problematic, like, you know, you've got a verse in Matthew that you have the same verse in Mark, but Matthew's form comes in two different forms. You got some manuscripts word it one way, some word it another way. And the ones that word it the other way actually contradict what Mark says. Okay. And the other agree with Mark says. So a scholar asks herself, okay, which is more likely for a scribe to have done? Is a scribe likely to have created a contradiction with Mark?
Or resolved.
Or is a scribe more likely to resolve the contradiction? Well, you know, scribe's more likely to resolve the contradiction. Okay, that means that the reading that harmonizes is less likely original, which seems backwards, but it's been proved time and time again that that's right. So you look at that. You look at which readings would scribes be more likely to create. You look at the wording itself. Is this wording like this author normally words things? Does it use the vocabulary he normally uses? Does it use the grammar he normally uses? Does it fit within its context, or does it not fit in its context? Because the author, you know, is probably going to write like the author. And so if you get verses in there that doesn't sound like the author, that's a suggestion that somebody else wrote them. And so what you end up doing is you look at this external evidence, then you look at these kinds of considerations on the internal level. And what you hope is that you get a match, that the external evidence and the internal evidence agree. And that's when that happens, pretty much people say, okay, that's that. What happens generally, though, is that you get different kinds of evidence, different kinds of external, different kinds of internal, and they go different directions. And that's where it gets interesting for scholars, because then you can make an argument.
So you mentioned earlier that scribes would change or add to the New Testament based on their own theologies, make things clearer, make things less available to people they would view as heretics. Do you see similar changes based on their social concerns and the world they were living in?
It's one of the reasons I just love the study of Christianity, starting with Jesus, but going up, you know, for the first 300 or 400 years is basically what I do. And one of the reasons I love it is because there's just so much controversy. There's obviously there's controversies with non-Christians, with pagans, you know, Gentiles who are polytheists. There's controversies with Jews. There's controversies within Christianity that aren't related to theology directly. And so my idea for this next book was going to be, I was going to look at these very social issues, where I'd have a chapter, for example, on scribes changing the text because of their views of women. Or, for example, to lower the status of women as it was getting lowered as Christianity progressed over the centuries. Early on, women had a fairly central role in the early Christian churches, but it wasn't long before their voices got squashed. And so did that affect scribes? Or what about Jewish-Christian relationships? You know, Christians are in conflict with Jews. And did the anti-Judaism that you find in some Christian circles affect scribes who might have been anti-Jewish? So yeah, the answer is yes.
Thank you. And I'm assuming the same answer, that these changes are incorporated and remain in the New Testament manuscript, well, the New Testament translations that we use today.
Well, let me give you two examples. Can I do that?
Please.
Okay, so let me get the one that involves Jewish Christian relationships. I find is very interesting. This is only in the Gospel of Luke. When Jesus is being crucified, in Luke's Gospel only, he prays to God. He says, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." That verse is missing from some manuscripts.
Interesting.
And it's a question, why? Why would a scribe take that out? That's the kind of thing I'm really interested. I'm interested not only in what was the original text, of course I'm interested in that, but also why would somebody take that out? Was it an accident? Like, did they just skip a line? Did their eye skip or something? Or is there something else? And what's really interesting is that in early Christianity, that verse was taken to refer to Jesus forgiving Jews for having him crucified. He wasn't praying forgiveness for Romans, according to this early Christian interpretation, praying for forgiveness for Jews. And so I've written a little bit about this, but I've argued that, why would a scribe want to take those verses out? You don't want Jesus praying for forgiveness for Jews. God didn't forgive the Jews. God destroyed Jerusalem because of what they did to Jesus. He didn't forget. So Jesus obviously is not going to pray for forgiveness, and God's not going to ignore his prayer. And so it looks like somebody's taken these verses out, this verse out, in order not to have Christ pray for forgiveness for Jews. And so, that's interesting for me. Anyway. With the women thing, another one, this one's interesting because in this case, it's hard to know whether you can argue that there's any external evidence for it. But it matters for Paul's understanding of women. As you probably know, Paul is sometimes classified as a real misogynist by people today, as being somebody who's really opposed to women. I think it's a misreading of Paul. I don't think Paul was a misogynist in the way that people label him. In part, there are passages that tell women, be quiet in the churches. One of them is in the book of 1 Timothy that claims to be written by Paul, but I don't think Paul wrote it. And I'm not alone in that. Most critical scholars don't think Paul wrote it. But there is a passage in 1 Corinthians that Paul did write. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 33 and 34, Paul tells the women in Corinth to stop talking in church, but to be silent. And that if they've got any questions, ask their husbands at home. And he tells them, that's not appropriate for them to be talking. So women are not allowed to speak in church, which is a verse that, of course, gets used to say you can't have women preachers, or let alone priests. And so, but the thing is, there's very good reason for thinking Paul did not write those two verses. All the manuscripts have them, verses, but some manuscripts don't put them in the same place. Some manuscripts put them in a different place in 1 Corinthians 14. And so some scholars have argued that what's happening is these started out as a note in a margin by somebody who was like, Paul's forbidding some things happening in church. And some scribe also adds, and women, be quiet in church. You got any questions, just add, and puts it as a marginal note. Next scribe comes along, says, my predecessor left those verses out, put them in and sticks them back in. And then that manuscript gets copied, and all of a sudden they're part of the Bible. But so it would be, and so there are good reasons for thinking that that's what happened. But it would be a scribal error rather than something Paul really wrote. It's always very difficult to prove, and so the thing about doing history is it's about establishing probabilities. What's the most probable explanation for this? And even though we have thousands of manuscripts, there are tens of thousands of manuscripts, hundreds of thousands we don't have. And so we almost never get the smoking gun. That's the problem.
Thank you. How were the earliest printed editions of the New Testament put together?
As most people know, printing with movable type was invented by Gutenberg in the 15th century. The first thing he printed was a copy of the Latin Bible. And so the Gutenberg Bible is a very important book that took several years to print because it was hard to set print back then. So this is happening in Western Europe. And in Western Europe, Latin is the language of the Bible. Greek is for the Easterners. So even though the Bible was really written, nobody in the West reads Greek, basically, except for really trained classicists. And so, some years later, in the early 16th century, scholars realized, the Bible was written in Greek. We need to be able to read it in Greek. We should probably do that. And so, the first one who actually had a Bible produced and printed and available to the public was a classical scholar named Erasmus, whose New Testament came out in 1516. He was racing against the clock because he knew he was a Protestant, and he knew that Catholics were coming up with their own edition, and he wanted to be the first. And so he was very good at Greek and everything, but he knew he wanted to print a Greek New Testament. How are you supposed to do it? Well, you've got to have some manuscripts, right? He basically had a 12th century manuscript that he had access to, that for the Gospels, and he kind of hunted around and he got a few manuscripts together. He had to borrow a manuscript of the book of Revelation from one of his friends who happened to have a Greek manuscript of Revelation, but it was missing the last page, the last 6 verses. And so Erasmus, basically he takes his manuscript and he just did his copy editing notes and gave it to a printer and said, "Here, print this." And so he did. And it was rushed out, as he himself admitted, based on a very late manuscript. We now have manuscripts that are probably at least 1,000 years old, not full manuscripts, but our earliest fragments go about 1,000 years earlier than that. And we have full manuscripts from the 4th century now. This one's from the 12th century. So, it's late, and it's got a lot of changes from the original text in it that earlier manuscripts don't have. But the thing is, since it was the first one to come out, printers started reprinting it. And everybody then started reprinting. And he made a couple more editions. He made a few corrections here and there. It was a real problem for the end of Revelation. His manuscript didn't have the last 6 verses. So what he did is he took the Latin version, the Latin Vulgate, and he translated the Latin into Greek. And he printed that as the ending of Revelation.
Awesome.
He came up with like wording that's not found in any Greek manuscript of Revelation, but it's found. This thing was printed so much that after a century or so, people were calling this thing the Textus Receptus, which is a Latin for meaning the received text. It was the text that everybody thought was the Greek New Testament, including the King James translators. They translated Erasmus's Textus Receptus. And so that's why the King James has readings in it that scholars today don't think are original, because it's not based on very good manuscript tradition.
It's God.